Hey, I want to welcome you back to our series we're calling Dreams and Detours about the life of Joseph. And I want to welcome our Sapulpa campus. I don't get to say this very often. Welcome our Broken Arrow campus. Glad to have you along with us as we wrap up this series today. If you've got a Bible or some place that you can follow along in a Bible on an app somewhere, I want you to get to Genesis 40. We're going to be there in just a little bit. Again, that's at the very beginning of your Bible, first book in the Bible, Genesis chapter 40. I should have known it was going to happen. It happens to me all the time, but as we've gone through this series, I noticed that in week number 1, I was preaching on the topic of disappointment. And as happens to me all the time, it is just typical for me to have to deal with some kind of difficulty when I'm preaching on a subject matter like that. So, we talked about disappointment, and there were things that I had that were disappointing, quite honestly, the week before and the week after. The second week of this series, we talked about the topic of temptation, the theme of temptation. And as you can expect, I probably tempted more than normal. That just seems to happen for us preachers. And so when it came to this week's theme that has to do with success, I thought to myself, well, I can deal with that. I mean, if I have to, deal with a little success, then, that's all right. I'm still waiting for, some of that to happen. But here's what, we don't think of success as something we have to overcome, right? In fact, this may be one of the more difficult of the passages for us to look at as a part of the story, because it's the sneakiest for us. It's the least expected for us. When things are going great, when things are in our favor, when things are just clipping along like the way that we want them are, when you've accomplished, you've achieved, you've got power, you've got some prosperity maybe. When life is going good, we just don't think that there's anything that we need to adjust or to overcome. But when you're there, you know this, that success can be a weight. It's something that can hold us back. It can keep us from God's dream. In fact, you can get so caught up in the American dream that you can forget about what God's dream is for your life. It happened to somebody in the Bible. We know him as the rich young ruler. He was successful by anybody's standards. He was rich, he was young, he was a ruler. I mean, just the name itself describes it. But when he talked to Jesus about, what he needed to do to get into the kingdom, Jesus said, you need to go sell everything. In fact, the only time that Jesus ever said that was, go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. And we're told that the man, he couldn't do it. In fact, it says at the end of the story that he went away sad. He went away sad because it was maybe too much, because it was too overwhelming for him. He just couldn't reconcile this idea of success. It weighed him down. I mean, think about some of the Old Testament heroes in the Bible when they got in the most trouble. Like it was King David, who in the springtime when all the other kings are going out to war, he stays at home, and then we have the issue with Bathsheba. Or it was Solomon, as things got successful in the kingdom and the richer that he got, even though he was the wisest man ever, it was a period of time that he also gave in to his many wives and concubines and began serving their gods. It was at the zenith of their careers. It was at the time when you would call them successful that success weighed them down. We've talked about how Joseph didn't let disappointment detour him. And we talked about how Joseph didn't let temptation detour him. But maybe this will be the greatest test that he will experience, the test of success. Let's just recap our story so far, and especially if you haven't been following along with us. We're talking about a guy named Joseph, and in chapter 37 we start reading about him. He was a guy who was the favorite of his father, and so this certainly caused some sibling rivalry. He had 10 older brothers, one younger brother. His dad even gave him a special robe that no one else had, and this caused, again, some annoyance. His brothers decided they wouldn't go as far as killing him, but they would sell him into slavery. And so it's not long before Joseph finds himself in a caravan headed out of his home country towards Egypt, and he's going to be sold as a slave. He's bought by a guy named Potiphar, who is a palace guard in charge of many things for Pharaoh in Egypt. And while he's there, he quickly kind of rises in the ranks till pretty soon he's in charge of everything within Potiphar's house. It's then that Mrs. Potiphar catches his eye, and she begins to make advances on him and is infatuated with him. And Joseph has nothing to do with that. In fact, one time when he's cornered, he actually runs out of the house. But this woman's scorned, and she's going to tell her husband, and Potiphar's going to have him thrown into prison. Just when things thought they were going well, then suddenly he's back now in a bad situation. He's in prison. While he's in prison, he meets a guy named not a guy named, but he meets Pharaoh's cupbearer and Pharaoh's baker. You see, in prison, he begins to rise in the ranks again, and these guys get put under his charge. And one night, they both have dreams, and they just look bad one day. And Joseph asks about what's going on, and they tell him his dreams. And Joseph is able to give them the meaning of their dreams. For the baker, he said, it's going to turn out bad for you. You're going to lose your life. But he said to the cupbearer, you'll have your position restored. He said, but when that happens, don't forget about me. You remember me. Sure enough, the cupbearer gets his position restored. But, at the very end of Genesis chapter 40, we're told that the chief cupbearer, he didn't remember Joseph. He forgot him, never even thought about it again. The very next verse, though, is interesting. When 2 full years had passed, we're at the very beginning of chapter 41 now. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. Now, that's the difficulty in reading that, because if Joseph would have known that in 2 years something was going to change, it would have been a lot easier for him to take that 2-year interval, right? But Joseph doesn't know. And so for another 2 years, he just sits in prison. He didn't know that he'd been forgotten. He's just waiting. If he had known that something was going to happen, it would have been a lot easier to deal with. But after 2 years, Pharaoh, we're told, has a dream. In fact, Pharaoh, we're told in chapter 41, has 2 dreams. One dream is about 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows, and the 7 skinny cows eat the fat cows up. And he has a similar dream about some heads of grain. And after the dream, Pharaoh gathers all his advisors, and he's looking for, answers. He wants to know what this is about, but nobody knows what his dreams mean. Then the cupbearer, 2 years later, says, wait a minute, I remember a guy, when I was in prison, he told me about my dreams. So Pharaoh now sends, 2 years later, sends for Joseph. And just like that, things changed. Everything changes for Joseph. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had been Joseph and Pharaoh calls me and says, hey, I need help with this dream, I might be thinking, hey, I've got some leverage here. I might be able to apply that, might be able to do something here. But before I tell you, Pharaoh, let me tell you about some things that I want. By the way, I've got some brothers. I'd like them to be thrown in prison. And there's this lady named Mrs. Potiphar. I'd like her to be taken care of. And that cupbearer who said he wouldn't forget me, but he did, even though he did remember me, he can spend a couple of years in prison now. Joseph doesn't do that. In fact, he interprets the dreams for Pharaoh. And he tells him this is what it means. There is going to be 7 years of agricultural abundance. Things are going to go good. But it's going to be followed by 7 years of famine. He interprets the dreams, but he doesn't stop there. Joseph then goes on and says, Pharaoh should put a wise and discerning person in charge, and then even gives some additional instruction. He takes an opportunity to tell Pharaoh what he should do. Now, he didn't have any way of having any kind of foundation to be able to do that. He just went on and took the opportunity. He's not qualified. This is the guy that went from teenager to slave to prisoner. But that's kind of what God does, isn't it? He takes somebody who's a nobody, and then he suddenly puts them in a position of authority and a position of information. Chapter 41, verse 39, after he interprets the dream, Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be put in charge of my palace, and all my people are submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger, put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as the second in command, and people shouted before him, make way. Then he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt. That's an incredible transformation, isn't it? I mean, things change for Joseph in a big way. He goes from wearing a jumpsuit in prison to now having a fine robe and a gold necklace and a ring on his finger. Things change for Joseph. The question that we have to ask is, does Joseph change? Does Joseph change? Is he going to get caught up in the Egyptian dream and forget about God's dream for him? Certainly wouldn't be the first time that that's happened, has it? That people get distracted, that success and prosperity and power get in the way of what had been a dream that we bought into before. It wouldn't be the first time. Will success become a barrier that keeps him from being a part of God's plan? Well, when you read ahead in the story, that's certainly not the case. Joseph doesn't let success sabotage God's dream for him. And I think one of the reasons why, let's just say it this way, avoiding the success trap means recognizing God's hand. I think one of the reasons why Joseph was able to avoid the trap of success and the barrier of success, the detour of success, was he recognized God's hand in everything that was happening. In fact, earlier in the story, when Pharaoh asked him if he could interpret, if Joseph could interpret the dreams that he had, do you remember how Joseph responded? We're going to back up for just a minute. Still in chapter 41, verse 16, Joseph said, I cannot do it, replying to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Joseph said, nope, not something I can do, but God can do that. He's going to be the one. Now, Joseph could have said, listen, let me tell you my dream forecast, percentage rate. It's pretty good. The cupbearer, the baker, I got those both right. Let me tell you how good I am. But Joseph doesn't step into the spotlight. He doesn't embrace the applause. Joseph simply says, I can't, but God can. In fact, that's just a good thing to do when you have success in life. That ought to be your response. Because what happens is when you start taking credit, God tends to withdraw. See, the more you acknowledge God, the more He tends to show up. What happens is when you're humble, it creates space for God to step in and to demonstrate His power. And maybe Joseph learned some of that humility along the way, because at age 17, when those dreams first came, his response was, hey, look who's going to bow down to me someday. But it was after being a slave, it was after being in prison that his spirit is humbled. And he says, I can't, but God can. In fact, we even see it just a little bit later, Joseph recognizing God's hand and his gratitude, his thankfulness for that. After Pharaoh puts him in charge, and he's actually given a wife, and he has a couple of kids. Listen to what Joseph does. Chapter 41, verse 51. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, it is because God has made me forget all my troubles and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim and said, it's because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. And so Manasseh actually means forgetting my troubles. Ephraim actually means that I've been made fruitful. And so when you take those names, he says, listen, this is what happened. Not only is Joseph saying, I have forgotten what's happened to me. I'm looking ahead. I'm optimistic about the future. Not only is he remembering God's faithfulness in the midst of all his suffering, that God has taken care of me, he's actually saying God has made that happen. God has made that happen. God has taken care of me. You see, when you find success in life, it's easy to forget God. It's easy to lose that gratitude to God. I worked hard for what I have, we might say, but who gave you that ability? I have some gifts that I bring to the table. Yeah, but who gave you those gifts? Listen, if you have any of that, if you grew up in an encouraging family, if you attended a great school, that's not just something that you did. Don't take it for granted. It didn't just happen. Don't take credit for what God has done. Joseph recognized God's hand in his life. Now back to our story. As Joseph had predicted, there was 7 years of abundance, and the crops came in, and Joseph's job was leading up this campaign to store up as much grain as possible to get through what followed, and that was this 7 years of famine. And sure enough, in that process, when the famine had spread, chapter 41, verse 56, when the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. Not just Egypt, though, and all the world. All the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. In fact, it was severe in Joseph's home country and his hometown. And so when his father Jacob hears that there's grain to be bought in Egypt, guess what? He decides to send some of the family down to check it out. So Joseph's 10 older brothers, they travel to Egypt. They're going to buy grain, but guess who they have to go through to be able to do that? Skip to chapter 42. Chapter 42, verse 6. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. So here the story takes a turn. Now Joseph's brothers are coming asking for grain, and they bow down to this guy that they know they have to appease to be able to purchase their grain. And in the next couple of verses, we're told that Joseph recognizes his brothers, but his brothers don't recognize him as they're bowing down to him. Verse 9 says that Joseph remembered his dreams about them. I wonder if that's in the process of them bowing down, that Joseph, recognizing his brothers, then remembers the dreams. Joseph had everything at his disposal. He could have had them arrested on the spot. He could have had them killed. Nobody would have questioned his authority. He could have just sent them home with a meager amount of food, knowing that they would get by for a while. But instead, what Joseph does is he puts his brothers through a series of tests. He wants to know if his brothers have changed. And so he accuses the brothers of being spies. He knows they're not, but it's a ploy. And they are required to leave one of their brothers back there. It's Simeon. And they're to go back and get their younger brother, Benjamin, that they had spoken about. And so there's this test of loyalty. Would the brothers come back for Simeon? Well, they do eventually come back, and they do eventually return with the youngest brother, Benjamin, and another test takes place. During a dinner that they're having, Joseph makes sure that Benjamin has 5 times the amount of food that anybody else has. The test is one of, would they be jealous of Benjamin? Because they'd been jealous of Joseph those years before when he got that fancy coat. They wanted to know, are they going to be jealous now of their younger brother? Well, after that dinner, he's going to send them on their way. He makes sure that they have grain, but he make sure that a steward hides a special silver cup in Benjamin's sack of grain. And as they head home, Joseph has them chased down. They find, of course, that cup in Benjamin's sack, and Benjamin is required to become a slave. And so there's another test, a test of sacrifice. Would the brothers leave Benjamin, or would they do everything they can? Would they risk their lives for his? And so that's exactly what happens. They put their lives on the line. They'd been selfish 20-something years before. What are they going to do now? Well, we read the text that Judah is the brother who pleads for Benjamin's life, offers himself up as a substitute. Remember, this was Judah. It was the same guy who had persuaded his brothers to get rid of Joseph. And now he's the one that's bargaining for him. And again, we just see another example of God changing lives and changing hearts. They don't know it, but Joseph is in on all this interchange, and he can hear everything that's happened, and because of that, he can no longer hold back. Chapter 45, verse 4 and 5, Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they'd done so, he said, "I'm your brother Joseph." They didn't believe him at first. "I'm your brother Joseph." In case you don't know, the one that you sold into Egypt, I love that line, as opposed to any other brother you might have sold, the one you sold into Egypt. "And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Listen, you sold me, but listen, you need to know that God sent me. In fact, verse 7, "God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." They wouldn't have survived the famine. "So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt." I want you to notice that Joseph begins by identifying himself by what had been done to him, what his brothers had done. "You sold me into slavery." But he didn't stop there. "You sold me, but God sent me." He's saying the same thing. He's telling the same story, but it's in a different way. He's framing it differently. How he sees it is different. It's a different perspective. Joseph is saying this was all a part of God's story. God used this. You did this, but God was doing this in the background. And in an instant, God takes Joseph and changes him to the point where he extends grace and forgiveness and mercy to his brothers. And this incredible thing, these guys who sold him into slavery. Now Joseph says, "Listen, you intended it for something, but God was behind all this. God sent me." So here's a question you have to kind of ask as you read through, because it's easy to just read through and not ask the difficult questions, because that's what we do sometimes when we read the Bible. But the question is, why? Why would Joseph forgive his brothers at this point? Why would he seemingly let them off the hook? Why didn't he exact his revenge? Why didn't he get some paybacks right here? I think it's because somewhere along the line he caught a glimpse of the bigger picture of what God was doing, and that he had a role in it, that this wasn't just about him. And that's what happens. When we get behind the idea that it's not all about me, and we align ourselves with what God is doing, it allows us to process and deal with the difficult things that have happened that we've experienced in life. In fact, at the end of the story, after Jacob comes to Egypt and eventually dies, the brothers get a little scared at that point in time. Dad's gone. Now is Joseph going to go back to, getting his revenge on us? Chapter 50, verse 20 says, "You intended to harm me," Joseph said, "but God intended for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." You used it for evil, but you need to understand, God used it for good. You intended to hurt me, but God intended to use me. You did this, but God was at work behind the scenes. And so somewhere along the line, Joseph realized that the story wasn't so much about him as it was about what God wanted to accomplish through him. It wasn't just about him. His life wasn't just about him. His story wasn't just about him. There was something bigger going on. So another way that we avoid the success trap is it means recognizing that life is not just about self. That your life is not just about you. My life is not just about me. Life is not just about self. Now, social media, that is constantly reinforcing the idea that life's all about us. I mean, it's all about how we look, how we're perceived. It's seeing what other people are doing, what we might be missing out on, constantly taking pictures of ourselves. What social media does, if we can just demonize it for just a minute, it puts us at the center, right? It puts us at the center. And it is easy to make life all about self. And when life is all about self, then it becomes more difficult to forgive people because you've got to get paybacks. You've got to get evened up here. The score has to be evened up. It's difficult to extend mercy when life is all about self. When we're resentful, when we're bitter, when we're angry, that comes from it being about us. We get preoccupied with ourselves. But Joseph, he forgives his brothers. He doesn't try to even up the score. He doesn't try to get revenge on them. And look at why I think he does that. Just back a verse, chapter 50, verse 19. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" See, what Joseph does is he acknowledged that he wasn't God, that this wasn't his story, it was God's story. And when you're struggling with resentment and unforgiveness, if that's you, if you're struggling with that, it might be time to quit playing God. Because it's not your job to make sure that person repents. It's not your job to make sure they receive just punishment. It's not your job to change them. That's God's job. That's what God does, not you. And so for Joseph, it wasn't as much about what happened to him as much as it was about how he responded to what happened to him. Jerry Sitzer was driving his minivan along with his family when he was hit by a drunk driver. And in that collision, he lost 3 generations of his family. He lost his mother, he lost his wife, he lost his younger daughter. After that wreck, he had to process how he could come out without a scratch, but everybody else in the wreck was killed, and dealing with life after that fact. In fact, he wrote a book. It was called A Grace Disguised, and his conclusion was basically, what happened to me doesn't have to be the defining moment of my life. That tragic thing, that thing. I mean, for Joseph, that being thrown in prison, being sold as a slave, being betrayed by his brother, that didn't have to be the defining moment in his life. He goes on and says, it's not what happened to us, it's our response to what happened. The defining moment of our life can be our response to what happened to us. I mean, that's really the story of Joseph's life. That's really how we should see things. And so you're not responsible for the abuse that happened to you, but you are responsible for how you respond to that abuse. You're not responsible for your parents' divorce, but you are responsible for how you respond to that divorce. You're not responsible for the cancer diagnosis that you received, but you're responsible for how you respond to that diagnosis. You're not responsible for the downsizing that happened at work, but you're responsible for how you respond to that. You're not responsible for the depression that you have, but you are responsible for how you respond to that. And you're responsible for how you respond to the successes of life. You're not responsible for all the success in your life. That's God. Don't take credit for something that you didn't cause. You may have some gifts, you may have some abilities, but those are from God. You can't take credit for that, and so you're not responsible for the successes of life, but you are responsible for how you respond to the success of your life. And ultimately, that's the story of Joseph. Joseph's response and God's redemption. That's his story. It's not so much about what happened. It's about how he responded and about how God used it. Pray with me. Father, we thank you for the story of Joseph. Thank you for being able to see his life and be able to apply so many elements of that to life. God, we're grateful for the way that he responded to success, that he didn't allow it to stop the dreams from his life. Father, we see it so many times where people struggle and people get to a place in life and they get captivated by the American dream, and they lose sight of the dream that you have for them. And so, Father, would you help us? Would you help us to acknowledge you, to see your hand in everything that happens in this world? And would you help us, God, to make sure we understand that life is not just about us? Would you help us to see, like Joseph, the bigger picture, the upper story of what you're doing and how we fit in to your story? We thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.